I'm going to start this morning with a story that does not make me proud. It was Easter. We had only two little girls at that time. One was 6 months old, the other was not yet 3 years old. As some of you know, something strange happens when you go from one child to two. It becomes nearly impossible to leave your home. You can't find anything, you can't find anyone. If you can find them, you can't dress them. Car seats disappear. You forget where you're going. You can't remember what time you were supposed to leave, but you're pretty sure it was about 30 minutes ago. But despite all of that had just happened to us, we were a happy little family. The little baby, Eleanor, whom some of you know, had just reached that magical age of 6 months where babies become so cute and responsive, and we all loved her. Her older sister, Esther Ruth, loved her. We couldn't get anywhere on time, but we were happy. And here it was, Easter in Victoria. The grass had that lush, rich, early springtime look and feel. The daffodils were up. The air, you were just starting to believe that the air really would become warm. It was already scented. And we were going to church on Easter Sunday morning. The girls had new Easter dresses. We were happy. Esther Ruth, the almost 3-year-old, was ready first, all excited in her new white dress. But it was tricky getting the baby and everything else ready. So Heidi sent Esther Ruth outside to play while we finished packing up. Some of you are hearing the foreshadowing in this. The outside, the white dress, the happiness. When Heidi saw we were nearly ready inside, she said, "You go get Esther Ruth while I gather up Eleanor and the bags, and we'll just all meet at the car." And it was a happy Easter plan. So I went outside, and I couldn't see Esther Ruth at first, so I walked around to the side of the house to find her near a downspout. Happily and vigorously splashing her hands in a 5-gallon bucket filled with muddy water. She had even put extra mud blobs in there, she told me, to make it extra brown. And in her beautiful white dress, she now looked like a pinto horse. I was not aware at that moment that I had lost my mind. I just picked her up, held her at arm's length to keep myself clean, and I walked back to the front door. Heidi could fix everything. I arrived there at the exact moment Heidi opened the front door, and Heidi, who was somehow managing to carry the baby and all of our church-going necessities, she was surprised to see me, expecting me to be in the car with our angelic toddler in her car seat. So she didn't really take in the whole situation. "Oh," she said, "did you forget the car keys?" Again, I was not yet aware that I had actually entered a psychotic break. But at this point, in response to Heidi's innocent question, I held Esther Ruth out in front of me, and I said to my wife, on Easter Sunday morning, "Were you born this stupid?" I think you can imagine how that took a little bit of the edge off our Easter joy. I felt horrible for saying it. Heidi felt horrible for having married someone capable of saying it. But this is so often our human pattern, isn't it? We have something wonderful, and we wreck it. You don't know what you've got till it's gone, the song says, but I don't think that's true. I think often we do know what we've got. We do know how wonderful it all is and how beautiful it all is and how fragile it all is, and we still wreck it. And then we begin the work of restoration, and that's our story. So there's a reason I told you that about myself, a reason besides the additional public service of helping you all feel better about yourselves, or perhaps helping you feel better about your spouses, or feeling better that you don't have a spouse, feeling grateful. And here's the reason I told you that story. For the past 3 sermons in this mini-series that we're in on law and covenant, I have been painting a picture. We've talked about all the good things the law did for the Israelites, protecting them from the anxiety-soaked ancient Near Eastern cultures that surrounded them, turning the Israelites into a nation, where in theory, everybody had freedom and everybody had the chance to flourish, not just those few at the top. And we have talked about how the law didn't just show up on its own, but in the context of God's covenant, which meant a relationship initiated by God for the benefit of the Israelites. And last week, we explored the question, relationship with whom that the Israelites might have had, and we looked at how God answered that question through the personal name Yahweh, by showing the Israelites what is in the very heart of God, and that heart is, of course, love. All this is very beautiful. God, who is love, initiates a covenant with the Israelites to help them get to know love and to help them flourish as individuals and as a nation. It's lovely. It's also very happy, cozy family going to church on Easter Sunday. So you know what's going to happen next. The Israelites wreck it. Over and over again, even if they do know what they've got before it's gone, they do what we all do. They make awful decisions and do awful things and say awful things and just generally ruin things. And so much of the Old Testament is an honest account of all of that. Can you imagine being a people group and working hard to preserve all the times you really, really messed up? That's what they did, and it's such a great gift to all of us to see that honesty. And in response to all that ruination, as we heard Yahweh promise last week, while there will be consequences, Yahweh will never give up on the Israelites, even when they keep on sinning and wrecking things. We heard last week from God, I will not reject them or despise them so as to destroy them completely. I will not break my covenant with them, for I am Yahweh. That's what that name means. That's what that character is. So this week and next week, we're going to be completing the mini-series on Law and Covenant by exploring what that looks like, God not giving up. How does Yahweh remember the covenant? How does God not give up? And the answer in the Old Testament, and even beyond the Old Testament, is that God sends prophets. So at this point, we have to acknowledge that we've come to yet another type of biblical literature that we haven't really talked about much this year or last year, and that's prophecy. And it's important to get something right here. In the Bible, the word prophecy does not mean fortune-telling, like it does in our common everyday language. In the Bible, it's different. Prophets were those people who were given the difficult task, the dangerous task, of speaking truth to power, of telling individuals and society at large where they were falling short of the covenant. They did sometimes refer to the future, but it was almost always the immediate future, as in, here's what's going to happen if you don't get things straight. So when you hear the word prophet associated with the Bible, don't think Nostradamus or somebody gazing into a crystal ball. That's not what prophet means in the Bible. Instead, think of someone like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., someone who, in ways many people found uncomfortable, brought a nation face to face with its own hypocrisy. That's a prophet. In fact, the simplest way to describe prophecy in the Bible is covenant enforcement. That's it. Just covenant enforcers, little police cars, covenant enforcement. When the Israelites wrecked things, when the people failed to keep the commandments and therefore lost sight of the character and the heart of God and therefore failed to be a society motivated by God's concern for the poor and the needy and the vulnerable, when that happened, The prophets showed up to make clear, sometimes painfully clear, what was going wrong, to make clear what ought to be done to fix things, and to reassure the Israelites that God had not given up on them. Even though the prophets were so different, they all had the same message over and over and over again. It's the same message. Keep the covenant, keep the covenant, keep the covenant. That's it. And in being the same message over and over again, biblical prophecy is, strangely, a lot like advertising. It's the same message over and over and over again. And like advertisers, the prophets had to keep coming up with all sorts of new and creative ways of getting people's attention. You know what it's like when you hear the same thing too many times. You actually stop hearing it. So the prophets had to keep spicing things up. And, again, like advertisers, the prophets sometimes resorted to things like attention, classic attention-getting things like sexual imagery and violence and other powerful, shocking images, just to make sure the message cut through the apathy, cut through all the noise. And it's even more amazing when you realize that the prophets performed this work. They didn't write it. I don't know if you're aware of that. Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel and all these people, they weren't sitting around writing books. They were doing performance art. And their performance art and the imagery they used in their storytelling was so memorable that later people could write down what happened. So the original Israelites did not read works of prophecy. They heard them. They watched them performed. And sometimes, I have to say, the Israelites found themselves in the presence of some of the weirdest and most shocking performance art anyone has ever experienced, as you'll hear. Flannery O'Connor, a writer I've talked about before, once wrote that if you are an artist with a hostile audience, here's what she said, you have to make your vision apparent by shock. To the hard of hearing, you shout. And for the almost blind, you draw large, startling pictures. And that's exactly what the prophets had to do, because they had hostile audiences. Who wants to be told they're not keeping the covenant? Who wants to be told the way they're living their life is wrong? So the prophets had to resort to some pretty dramatic stuff, which is why if you open the Bible at random to a book of prophecy and just start reading without this background knowledge, it can be really shocking and unpleasant. Now, the prophets weren't always shocking and unpleasant, just mostly. But there were times when the prophets had to communicate to the Israelites the heart of God that was behind all of this, to remind the Israelites that Yahweh is a God who will never let them go, never give up. And in those moments, the prophets delivered loving, gentle, and caring messages of divine love, some of the most beautiful passages in the Bible. And as Kathy hinted, we're saving those for next week. And we're dwelling on the passages that, you get older, but it's hard to stop being a 12-year-old boy. It's really hard. And so we can dress it up as the work of the Lord up here, but I'm just having fun this morning. That's what's going to be coming, I'll be honest. We've got 2 Sundays left before Advent. This week, next week. Today we're going to look at the stern and the shocking and the just plain weird side of the prophets. Partly for the delight of it, but partly because it does teach us something important about God's passion. And next week, as we prepare for Advent and the Emmanuel, God with us that's coming, then we're going to look at the more gentle and beautiful side. But there are 2 more questions we need to answer before we get into it. Who are these prophets? What books of the Bible are we talking about? And it's a lot. A lot of the Old Testament is works of prophecy. We're talking about Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, sometimes Daniel. Nobody really knows how to categorize Daniel. And then the group that is sometimes just called the 12 in the Jewish tradition, because it all fit on one scroll, all these 12. Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi. I always like those last 4. That's who we're talking about. Those are the books we're talking about. And the next question is, when did they do their work? And so for that, we're going to return to this fine graphic that we're going to have on the screen here, I think. Oh, yes. And yeah, that's right. This comes at no additional cost. So this is what I call the Israelite national happiness graph. It is not scientific. It was just a picture I needed so that I could picture how everything fit together in the story of Israel. You hear it in bits and dabs out of order, and I needed to put it all together. So there it is. So the first valley, the first really low point, is the slavery in Egypt. And the second valley is when everything fell apart and they lost their land and they were carried away and they didn't have a temple anymore or a functioning city and they were gone. All the Old Testament prophets I just listed did their work in the second valley, beginning with the breakup of the kingdom and then the descent leading down to the eventual destruction of both kingdoms. One kingdom to the Assyrians and the other to the Babylonians. And once both kingdoms were lost, it felt like this. Next one. They didn't know they were in a valley at that time. They just thought it was the end of the world. The end of their world. And at that moment, right there, the prophets worked very hard to remind the Israelites that in the name, in the character of Yahweh, there was hope. The prophet said, don't give up. It might feel like the end of the world, but it's never the end of Yahweh's relationship with you, which was astonishing news at this point. And then the next picture, sure enough, under the Persians, the next big empire, the Israelites were allowed to return to Jerusalem, and they were allowed to begin the long struggle of rebuilding. So all through the second valley, the prophets had to do all sorts of different things. They had to warn and scold and explain and help people reimagine and encourage, all depending on the situation. Okay, that's enough for the pictures. So we're ready to take a look at the more unsettling examples of these performance artists we call the prophets. And this unsettling work takes many, many forms. So how about we start with some violence? There's a passage from Micah, a stern and uncomfortably powerful message about what we would call economic injustice. Which just sounds like some kind of theoretical problem. But for God, it's never a theoretical problem. It's people, children, his children suffering. The people of Micah's time, though, were, like us, getting used to that kind of economic injustice. So, to the hard of hearing, you shout. And here is what the message that God gave Micah. Listen, you leaders of Jacob, you rulers, you who hate good, you who love evil, and here comes the image. You who tear the skin from my people, tear the flesh from their bones. You who eat my people's flesh, strip off their skin, break their bones in pieces. You who chop them up like meat for the pan, like flesh for the pot. Then you will cry out to Yahweh, but Yahweh will not answer you. At that time, Yahweh's face will be hidden from you because of the evil you have done. It's short, it's memorable, and it's not just economic injustice. To God, taking advantage of the poor is like cannibalism. It's a kind of social and spiritual cannibalism. It's perverse. And the shock of that perverse image of cannibalism is what made it memorable and what allowed it to break through and communicate just how abhorrent that behavior is to God. Now, we could spend a lot of time with violent imagery from the prophets, but why would we do that when we can move on to sexual imagery? So here again, there's a lot to choose from, but we're going to limit ourselves just to Jeremiah this morning. I'm just going to read you 3 short passages, and in all of them, the images are of sexual addiction and sexual unfaithfulness and sexual betrayal. God, in these passages, is the faithful husband, while the Israelites are adulterous wives. Or donkeys in heat, as we'll hear. You know, you don't hear phrases like this from the pulpit every day. Savor the moment. Here's one. You have lived like a prostitute with many lovers. Look up to the barren heights and see, is there any place where you've not been ravished? By the roadside, you sat waiting for lovers. You have defiled the land with your prostitution and your wickedness. You have the brazen look of a prostitute because you refuse to blush with shame. The message here, just to be clear, is not actually about prostitution. It's about we have something as close and intimate as a marriage. That's how I feel, says God, about this relationship. That's how important it is to me. So when you break it, it hurts. Here's another passage. Your children have forsaken me. They've sworn by gods that aren't gods. I supplied all their needs, and yet they committed adultery. They thronged to the houses of prostitutes. They are like well-fed, lusty stallions, each neighing for another man's wife. And here's a third passage from Jeremiah. Long ago you broke off your yoke and tore off your bonds, and you said, I won't serve you. Indeed, on every high hill and under every spreading tree you lay down like a prostitute. You are a swift she-camel, running here and there. You are a wild donkey sniffing the wind in her craving. In her heat, who can restrain her? Any males that pursue you need not tire themselves. At mating time, they will find you. Sometimes we forget these prophets had families. One could almost imagine hearing Jeremiah's mother saying, Jerry, why can't you write something nice?
You're supposed to say, this is the word of God.
Well, right. I would, Mom, but... Okay, we're going to have to move on, I'm afraid, from sexual imagery to really weird performance art. But our first example in this new category is also kind of sexual, so win-win. The prophet Hosea is instructed by God to marry an unfaithful woman, it says in our English translations. In Hebrew, it's more like a wife of harlotry. Thankfully, we don't really have an English word for that. This happy couple, they have 3 children. And they give the children these 3 names. God scatters, not loved, and not my people. All as pretty heavy-handed messages to the Israelites. But those poor kids. Everyone's calling their kids home for dinner. Not loved! Oh, it's me. And it seems to have affected those kids because when they grew up, they basically fired their mother, the wife of harlotry, and they sent her away. And as a result, she became enslaved in another household. And then God instructed Hosea to go find her, to buy her back, to buy her out of slavery and bring her back home. So Hosea does this. He redeems his unfaithful wife. And I say that word because redeem literally means, I don't know if you knew this, to buy again, to buy back, And Hosea's actions, of course, are strange. Marrying that woman, naming those kids, that is some of the, that's sustained years-long performance art. But it paints the picture of Yahweh's pursuit of the unfaithful Israelites, the people of harlotry, and Yahweh's desire to redeem them, always. Always choosing reconciliation over divorce. That is the imagery in the prophets. When it's between Yahweh and the people. Okay, now for some really weird performance art. This is from Ezekiel. God wanted Ezekiel to communicate to the Israelites that the situation they were in, the fight here, the battle between Jerusalem and the Babylonian Empire, it was very, very serious. It would result in the tragedy of an extended exile in Babylon, not just a short little moment, but a long exile. And it's all because they didn't keep the covenant. But God wasn't sure if the people would really absorb the message, if it were delivered normally. So God said to Ezekiel, and I'm just reading here, take a block of clay, put it in front of you, and draw the city of Jerusalem on it. Then lay siege to it. Set up siege works against it. Build a ramp up to it. Set up camps around it and battering rams. It will be under siege, and you shall besiege it. This will be a sign to the house of Israel. It's basically a really elaborate Playmobil scene. But it would not have been in the living room like our Playmobil scenes tend to be. It was public. It was a public display of make-believe destruction of Jerusalem. And it was most likely located in the front, the outside court, the front of Ezekiel's home, so it would be public. It would kind of be like that one neighbor who goes crazy every year with Christmas decorations. Although when we're done with Ezekiel, you'll be really glad for that neighbor, I think. I'm just making you feel better about all sorts of things in your life this morning. So the stage is set for Ezekiel, and here's what he is supposed to do. You ready for this? God tells him to lie down next to Jerusalem on his left side without moving much for 390 days. I said 390 days. One for each year that a certain people group had not been faithful to Yahweh. Then Ezekiel, this is the encore, is supposed to turn over and lie on his right side for another 40 days. This people group was only unfaithful for 40 years, so only 40 days. During that whole time, Ezekiel is to eat nothing but bread and water, and again, this is out in public. And God has very specific baking instructions. I'd like you to listen to this passage from the Bible. Thank you. Take wheat and barley, beans and lentils, millet and spelt, put them in a storage jar and use them to make bread for yourself. You are to eat it during those days that you lie on your side. Eat the food as you would a loaf of barley bread. Bake it in the sight of the people, using human excrement for fuel.
You making this up?
It's Ezekiel chapter 4. I am not making this up. You can check that later. Now, we will hear in just a second that Ezekiel has an objection to that recipe. But first, understand the intention here. The object lesson of that special cooking fuel is supposed to be that while they are in Babylon, it will be impossible for the Israelites to follow their food purity laws. God is basically saying through this performance art, buckle up, people. It's going to be gross. But Ezekiel objects. And he says to God, and again I'm just reading, then Ezekiel said, "Not so, sovereign Yahweh. I have never defiled myself. From my youth until now, no impure food has ever entered my mouth." "Very well," God said. "Instead of human excrement, I'll let you bake your bread over cow dung." It's a win. Now again, this is weird, and it is shocking, and it is by design to get the attention of those people who have gone numb to the fact that they are breaking the covenant and that they're called to keep the covenant. When a people group goes numb, you have to shout. Then There's the time God tells Jeremiah to wear a linen belt around for a while without ever washing it. Something that might be something more like a loincloth, or like underwear. Then Jeremiah is instructed to bury it near a river and leave it there for quite a while. Then he's instructed to dig it up. It's now completely degraded and useless, and he's supposed to carry it around, saying, "You're all like this!" Just plain weird. Why? To get the attention of the Israelites, to communicate that same message: keep the covenant, keep the covenant, keep the covenant. And we're just going to conclude with some examples of how some prophets upset the good old temple-going types. Those people who thought, I go to the temple, so I'm good, I've got it covered. And then just go on living lives of economic injustice. In the first one, Jeremiah goes to the temple. He sets himself up right at the front door. So everyone who's going into the temple has to go by Jeremiah. And he's shouting this: don't trust in deceptive words and say, this is the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord. Instead, change your ways. Change your actions. Deal with each other justly. You must not oppress the foreigner. You must not oppress the orphan or the widow. You must not shed innocent blood in this place. You must not follow other gods to your own harm. But no, instead, you are just trusting deceptive words. This is the temple of the Lord. And those words are useless. And then we'll hear Amos and Isaiah really take a strip off the temple goers with some upsetting messages. Messages from God. Here's what Amos says. Here's a message from God for you people. God says, I hate your religious festivals. I despise them. I can't stand it when you get together. Sure, you bring me burnt offerings and grain offerings, but I won't accept them. Even though you bring choice fellowship offerings, I have no regard for them. Away with the noise of your songs. I will not listen to the music of your harps and bass guitars. Why is God so upset? Because God wants this. Let justice roll on like a river, and righteousness like a never-failing stream. Amos wouldn't have to bring this message if justice were rolling on like a river, if righteousness were a never-failing stream. By the way, that's a passage that Martin Luther King quotes in his I Have a Dream speech. And Isaiah, similar idea. God says, all of your sacrifices, what are they to me? I have more than enough burnt offerings. Rams, the fat of fattened animals. We call that barbecue, by the way. I have no pleasure in the blood of bulls and lambs and goats. God's like, what do you think this does for me? Nothing. When you come to appear before me, who's asked all this of you? All this trampling in my courts. Stop bringing me meaningless offerings. And then God says something quite shocking. When you spread out your hands in prayer, I will hide my eyes from you. Even if you offer many prayers, I won't listen. Take your evil deeds out of my sight. Stop doing wrong and learn to do what is right. And then we are told what is right. Seek justice. Encourage the oppressed. Defend the cause of the orphan. Plead the case of the widow. And in that society, these were the people who generally did not have any legal standing in court. They were very, very vulnerable. And there you have it. Angry, yes. Upsetting, yes. Weird, violent, even same strange sexual images to get our attention. But why? So that we get a sense of the heart of God, which is about caring for the vulnerable, as Pamela read this morning, clothing the the naked, welcoming the stranger, feeding the hungry, things that Andrea invited us to participate in. Through the law and the covenant, the Israelites had been given a beautiful and precious gift. They had been set apart from the other ancient Near Eastern cultures. They had been given the social structures to make sure everyone had a chance to flourish. And what did they do with that gift? Like a certain idiotic young father on Easter morning, they wrecked it. But it was Easter. I like the fact that I did that dumb thing on Easter. Because Easter reminds us that death doesn't get the last word, and neither does stupidity get the last word. Because God keeps calling. God keeps inviting. And sure, like the Israelites, sometimes we all need a prophet to bring us the uncomfortable truth, to tell us something we don't want to hear. And sometimes those prophets have to shout at us. Sometimes they have to draw large, startling figures. But just like the ancient Israelites, even when the message has to be stern or shocking or just plain weird, behind all of it is the God of love. And when I say love, I don't mean love, all dewy-eyed and hearts floating off. I mean love, a passionate, I desperately care that your life is on tracks, so I might have to say astonishing things to you kind of love. I care so much, it makes me agitated kind of love. Sometimes God's love is, if it were music, easy listening. Sometimes it's comforting. But sometimes God's love is like rage against the machine. So hear this. Even when we wreck beautiful things, and we do, that love, God's love, in all its different modes, including the mode we explored this morning, that love is always there, always calling us, always inviting us. Amen.